This podcast contains adult themes and graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to Beyond Contempt True Crime. I need to provide you with some background before we start the show. Margaret Anderson's story changed my life and reshaped my perception of the world around me. The crimes against her took place right before my 8th birthday, and I was 12 when the last criminal was convicted. It was the first time I realized that not everyone has good intentions, and terrible people exist. If you were to speak with any of my high school classmates, or anyone who lived in Green Bay during that time, they might tell you a similar story. This crime had such an impact on the community that many of us still think about it 35 years later. People often find it difficult to pinpoint why they're interested in true crime. This story is my true crime why. I heavily leaned on Mike Duplass's book, Torture at the Back 40. Because the crime took place in 1983, so there was little online source material available. He did a great job of explaining who Margaret was as a person through interviews with her friends and her family. At the time of the crime, all we heard about were the 4 perpetrators. Mike's book gave her a voice, and hopefully that shows in this episode. In this retelling, I don't want to dwell on the awful details of this crime, but understand that we can't gloss over the brutality of this case, because that's what sets it apart from the most violent crimes we hear about. Green Bay is a small town of 100,000 people, and there are only a few degrees of separation between most of its citizens. Within Green Bay's city limits, there are 1 to 2 murders each year. Most of these small-town murders are caused by drugs, domestic disputes, or crimes of passion. This story did not fit that criteria, which made it even more disturbing to the community. The Green Bay police did a great job working the case, considering they had 2 other high-profile murders going on at the same time. Motorcycle gang subculture played a role. It was something that most Green Bay citizens knew little about, or even realized existed in their city. It's important to understand the degree of what Margaret endured. 3 of 4 of these convicted men now live free among us because of the laws in place in the 1980s. They served less than half of their 50-year sentences. You are listening to Episode 4, Margaret Anderson, Part 1 of 2. The night was devastatingly cold, as the temperature dipped below 0, and there was a light snow that had dusted the ground. Monday night had changed into Tuesday morning, since it was now 3:01 a.m. Truck driver Jamie Sunich just finished delivering cattle to the Packerland packing facility in Green Bay, Wisconsin. Jamie was headed to the pit area, a place where drivers could clean their trucks and shovel the cow manure out of their trailers. The high beams from his parked rig showed the outline of a person who staggered across the street. He couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, although long hair stuck to the person's face. And were they drunk? Or maybe homeless? He couldn't tell, and it was freaking him out. Jamie skipped cleaning his trailer because he had an uneasy feeling about the intentions of the figure meandering around in the dark. He put the semi into gear and took a right out of the lot onto Lime Kiln Road. Jamie checked the mirror and realized that the person was standing in the road's middle. However, all movement had ceased. Another truck driver, Michael Brisky, was heading towards Packerland Packing. He noticed Jamie's truck in the distance and got on the CB radio for a chat. Michael wanted to know how it was looking up there. Jamie told him to watch out because there was a freak across the railroad tracks. Michael slowed down and looked ahead. There was a body face down in the road, in a puddle of blood, across from the cleanout pit. He jumped out of his truck, ran to the guard shack, and told them to call the police. It was 3:11 a.m. Deborah Smits worked the 3 to 11 shift at paper company Procter & Gamble, but tonight it turned into a 12-hour slog. Like usual, she was heading home, traveling on Lime Kiln Road. She crossed the railroad tracks and slowed down when she saw a body in the road near the entrance of Packerland Packing. She got out of her car to check on the person, who was a woman. Deborah asked if she was okay and got no response. Deborah rushed to the guardhouse only to find that the police were on the way. She ran back to the road and turned her woman onto her back. Blood shot out of the woman's neck like it was a water fountain. This poor woman looked like she was trying to call out for help, but nothing came out because of the gaping hole in her neck. Deborah felt helpless because the only thing she could do was wait for the police to arrive. Patrolman Mike McGeeho and Bill Resch stopped at Country Kitchen on Main Street for some dinner. They hadn't eaten before their midnight shift started, and it was now 3 in the morning. After they put in their food order, a call came in. There was an intoxicated person by the railroad tracks on Lime Kiln Road. Mike told the kitchen staff to keep the order going because they would be back soon. They arrived on the scene within 4 minutes and found a woman laying on the road, kicking her legs and waving her arms. When they saw the severity of her condition, they called for extra help to block up the road and told the rescue unit to hurry up. The woman's clothes were disheveled, the zipper was open on her corduroy slacks, and her leather belt was unbuckled. She had shoes on, but no socks. Her hair matted to her head, but was laced with blood and snow. She had been beaten so severely that her eyes were swollen, and they couldn't even guess her age. The woman had a 6 to 8 inch cut along her throat. Her windpipe was severed, and steam was rising out of the wound. The officers covered her with a blanket to get her to stop flailing and slow the loss of blood. Everyone felt helpless. She took her last breath, and there were no more signs of life as of 3:21 a.m. on Tuesday, December 27, 1983. They placed calls to bring in detectives and the coroner. Police checked the pockets of the deceased woman, but there was no identification. Many of the officers on the scene that night were young in their careers. The brutality witnessed was difficult for a seasoned officer to experience, let alone someone new to the job. Coroner Jeannie Williams arrived at 3:40 a.m. to pronounce the victim deceased and took over the body so law enforcement could investigate the area. The officers followed footprints in the hard-packed snow over towards the manure cleanout area. The pit had concrete retaining walls, which were 100 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 2 feet high. A yellow booty sat in the pit's middle, and there was a fresh set of tire tracks not far from the regular semi-traffic. There was enough snow on the ground to see the outline of the tire tracks, but a specific tread pattern was not evident. An imprint in the snow was found where the person had fallen over the wall and rolled. It appeared that the person was dragged. There were a variety of blood spots in the snow. Detective Jerry Perrins had been out late the prior evening and was asleep when he got the call at 3:52 a.m. He raced down a Lime Kiln Road to help take measurements and collect evidence. Jerry carved out blood mixed with snow from the hard-packed ground and placed it into small glass vials. He found hair and placed that into another vial as well. A photographer was present to document the entire scene. He struggled because of the extreme weather. The cold kept draining the batteries, but the site was properly photographed. He wrapped the photography up around 6:30 a.m. The team spent most of the night taking various measurements between the blood spots. However, one thing they would get hammered on later at trial was not taking enough measurements on footprint sizes, tire tracks, and the distance between blood spots and the pit wall. Detective Perrins finished collecting evidence 5 hours later at 9 a.m. He consulted with the crime lab in Madison, Wisconsin, to ensure that he was preparing and preserving the blood evidence per protocol. He took the liquid evidence from the vials and air-dried it, ran it through filter paper, and let it dry overnight. The rescue squad removed the deceased woman from the road at 5 a.m. and transported her to St. Vincent Hospital for the autopsy. Besides the pathologist, they brought in a police sketch artist. They wanted to put Jane Doe's picture out into the community because without a driver's license or other identification, they had no clue who she was. And her face was too bruised and brutalized to release a photograph. They sent the sketch of the victim to local media before the autopsy was completed. The examination was underway, and there was a large amount of blood everywhere on her hair, body, and clothes. There were 4 missing buttons on her flannel shirt. Her bra was pulled up over her breasts, and one strap was down over the shoulder. They assessed the bra as being unhooked or torn. The pathologist removed 2 pieces of wood from her shirt and 1 piece from her left breast. Some of her ribs had been fractured. Her Levi corduroys were covered in blood. The zipper was open, but the button was snapped. There were 2 Marcus Theater movie tickets in her back pocket. Her underwear was only on one of her legs. The victim's ankles were bruised, and it almost appeared like someone had tied them. The autopsy staff tried to explain these injuries with the use of a rope or heavy cord, but it made little sense. There were so many lacerations that it was getting difficult to track. Upon further inspection, a series of bruises on her ankles took a linear shape and represented an injury that was consistent with being whipped. The pathologist placed a pool cue over the bruising, and it aligned with something that may have been used. Her eyelids were swollen and nose was broken. There was a skull fracture where the bone separated the nasal cavity from the brain. Her lower lip had a large cut, and her 2 upper incisors were knocked loose. There was a 5-inch wound across the neck, which was the fatal blow that severed her airway and vocal cords. This wound was 2.5 inches deep and extended as far back into her neck as the spinal column. She was nearly decapitated. The only reason the victim could survive as long as she did was because they missed her 2 carotid arteries when they cut her throat. Jane Doe's jugular vein was cut, which is what led to significant blood loss. Even with the extent of injuries to her body, the pathologist believed that she would have survived if she would have not received that fatal neck wound. There were lacerations by the lower vagina. The pathologist then discovered something disturbing when examining this area. There was a foreign object lodged inside. They performed an X-ray on the body and determined the foreign object was a cue ball, which was taken for evidence. A vaginal swab revealed that no sperm or seminal fluid was present. A blood draw revealed an alcohol content of 0.2, caffeine and nicotine were in her system. The victim had taken no other drugs. Her body was so severely beaten that pathologists had trouble counting the 89 injuries on her skin. The autopsy started at 7:45 that morning and went on until 5:20 that evening because of the amount of damage that this woman had sustained. The pathologist had 35 years of experience and 300 hours of doing autopsies. This was the worst case he had ever seen in his career. The news of an East Side murder had spread like wildfire throughout Green Bay. Officers visited every bar surrounding Lime Kiln Road. The motivation felt by law enforcement was unprecedented. They were on the hunt to see which bar was missing a cue ball. Sebastian's on Main Street was missing a pool ball, but the owner thought that someone stole it on Christmas night. Police determined that it was not related to the crime. Searching for a missing cue ball was going nowhere fast, and police next turned to investigating the ticket stub lead. They spoke to the teenager who sold movie tickets at the Stadium Cinema. She confirmed that Jane Doe was at the theater on December 26, and a male friend accompanied her. The teen had a detailed memory. She could recall that the male had a wallet on a chain, an orange hat, and a black motorcycle jacket. She even remembered that the male had visited the theater before that night. The young woman recalled the couple went Dutch, paid for their own movie tickets. The police sketch was already bringing in tips. Cecile Patsky thought the woman in the sketch had a strong resemblance to her next-door neighbor, but she was in such disbelief and could not bring herself to phone the police. Dar Putnam got on the phone and called Mary Lou Van Pay. She asked Mary Lou if she had seen the paper. Mary Lou had not. She motioned for someone to hand her a paper. Dar said that was her neighbor, Margaret's jacket. Mary Lou told Dar to call the police, which she did. Mary Lou studied the picture. It looked like the jacket that belonged to her husband's ex-wife. Police received 2 phone calls on the 28th of December. The first call came in and said the person in the sketch looked like a woman named Margaret Anderson. A second call came in from an anonymous female and recommended the police perform a welfare check on Margaret, who lived on 997 Shawano Avenue, because she had been missing for a few days. Police tried to look up fingerprints for this Margaret Anderson. They found that prints were taken in 1975, when this woman had applied for a bartender's license. There was a small photo attached to the application, and it matched the composite sketch. Police then checked the fingerprints on file against those from the victim. Again, there was a match. Police called the phone number listed for Margaret Anderson and spoke with her 17-year-old son, Bobby, to verify the clothes that she was wearing on the night of the 26th. Bobby had not seen her since Christmas night. He told the police that his mother had been seeing two men. One was a tall man named Lee. The second man was a biker known as Weasel. Bobby did not care for him at all. Police showed a picture of Margaret and Weasel to the teen who worked at the movie theater. She confirmed that the couple was there on the night of the 26th. Weasel's real name was Terry Affle. Police tracked him down at the Back 40 Tavern and wanted to take him in for questioning. Terry said that he would only answer questions with a lawyer present. Knowing full well that the police would look for him, he had already contacted a lawyer earlier that morning. They set up the interview for the following day. Police received permission to search Margaret Anderson's home. They took photos, a checkbook, and a list of numbers that included Terry Affle's. Officers brought Margaret's ex-husband, Bobby Sr., down to St. Vincent Hospital morgue. They unzipped the body bag and revealed the woman's face. Bob could scarcely recognize his ex-wife because of all the bruises. He confirmed that it was Margaret Anderson. Margaret was born on October 6, 1948, and was the youngest of 5 kids who grew up in Malta, Montana. By the time 1983 rolled around, she had lived half her life in Montana and the other half in Wisconsin. Living in Malta gave a person a real sense of what it was like to live in the Old West. It was commonplace to see a person with a gun on their belt or a rifle on the front seat of their truck. Margaret was younger than her brothers and sisters and was 9 years younger than her next oldest sibling. Her parents had already separated by the time she was still a young child. Margaret's mom, Mary, ran a cafe in her namesake, and her father, Charlie Koppel, owned a sheep business. Charlie enjoyed drinking more than he should, and it caused their marriage to deteriorate. Everyone in the Koppel family worked hard. Margaret worked in her mom's cafe as a little girl and needed a step stool to reach the cash register. Her brothers helped their father with the sheep business. The men would drive the animals to fresh grazing land and work on the ranch. The young men were rolling their own cigarettes by age 6 and were shooting guns by age 11. The boys would hunt, eat prairie dogs, gophers, and baby ducks when they had downtime from working on the ranch. Margaret was close with her sister Eileen's oldest daughter, Marilyn, because they were close to the same age. Margaret's best friend was her neighbor Rosie Coleman, and they did everything together. Later on, Rosie would name her daughter after Margaret. Margaret dated Rosie's older brother Jim, and the girls saw less of each other. Jim and Margaret dated for about 6 months. He broke up with her and went back to dating a previous girlfriend. Jim lives with a heavy sense of regret and grief which occupy his heart. He wonders if Margaret would still be alive if they had just stayed together. They returned Margaret's body to Malta, Montana for a burial, so she could be with her friends and family. Rosie helped pick out Margaret's clothes for the funeral service, and her brother Jim was a pallbearer. When Margaret was 17, she went with one of her friends to the Glasgow Air Force Base, about an hour away from Malta. Her friend wanted to meet up with a boy that she had a romantic interest in. Margaret's life forever changed on that day when she happened to meet helicopter pilot, senior airman Bob Anderson. Bob's good friends liked to call him Andy Bob. He was from Wisconsin, and his favorite hobbies included laughing, partying, and drinking. Margaret was head over heels for him. Her family did not care for Bob Anderson and felt that he lacked respect for their parents. Margaret dropped out of high school that year and married Bob on the Air Force Base on November 20 of 1965. Her dad chose not to attend the wedding. Bob and Marge stayed on the Air Force Base until September of the next year. On September 5th, they had their first and only child, Bobby Jr. Bob completed his military service, and then the family moved to his home state of Wisconsin. Moving away from her friends and family was tough on Margaret. She was a young woman with a baby, living in an unfamiliar place, and knew no one other than her husband. The couple bought a home on 997 Shawano Avenue, which was across the street from Green Bay West High School and not far from the Fox River. The Andersons had shared a driveway with their neighbors, the Patskys. Margaret became friends with Cecile Patsky, who was 20 years older than herself. Mrs. Patsky could tell that Margaret missed her home state of Montana because she talked about it with such fondness and nostalgia. Cecile noticed that Bob Anderson seemed more interested in other things, like homebrewing beer, than he did his own son or wife. Margaret always kept the household running and in order. She received little help from Bob Sr. Dan and Dar Putman lived on the other side of the Patskys. Margaret and Dar were close in age. Their kids played together, and they too became good friends. Bob and Margaret's marriage started to collapse in the late 1970s. Margaret's behavior was erratic and often unpredictable. Her friends and family noticed this change in her personality. In 1978, Bob Anderson moved out of their home on Shawano Avenue and moved in with his girlfriend, Mary Lou Van Pay. The divorce was final in 1981. Bobby Jr. was able to navigate his parents' breakup and split time between their two homes. Margaret and her husband remained close friends, which was good for their son's well-being. Later, Bob and Mary Lou moved into a house on Shawano Avenue, only a few blocks down from Margaret. In 1979, Bob lost his auto parts job and took several bartending jobs at Two Doors Down, the Hydrant Lounge, and Main Attraction. Margaret also took jobs at the Hydrant Lounge and Main Attraction. Margaret's drinking increased significantly when she started bartending. This was about the time when Margaret's life spiraled. Bob told his girlfriend that Margaret showed signs of mental instability and paranoia after catching pneumonia a few years prior. The doctor prescribed medication, but she refused to take it. Margaret thought that the doctor was trying to kill her. Bob would often hang out at the Hydrant Lounge when Margaret was bartending. She worked there 5 days a week and also shot in the Pools Bar League. Bob and Margaret got to know many of the members of the Drifters Motorcycle Club who frequented the Hydrant. There was a noticeable uptick in disturbances and dust-ups at the bar. The Drifters were a rougher crowd than they were used to having. Margaret was a woman who was never afraid to get in the mix and break up some of the barroom conflicts, even against her better judgment. The owner of the Hydrant put his foot down and told the bikers to behave or find another place to hang out. The bikers were bad for business and were chasing the bar regulars away. Drifter Club member Mark Lukensmeyer opened a bar in downtown Green Bay called the Back 40. Motorcycle Club members stopped hanging out at the Hydrant and now were regulars at Lukensmeyer's new bar. Signs of Margaret's mental illness were clear to her friends and family, but no one was sure how deep it ran. They fired her for being a drunk at her bartending job. They hired her back, only to fire her again. Margaret took a job at JJ Security, where she would attend to businesses like James River Paper Company. They fired her after there were a few thefts at some of the locations she was guarding. Carl Burns was the owner of the Carlton West Dinner Theater, where Margaret got a job as a server. Carl's father, Roland, had taken an interest in Margaret. Margaret was not working anywhere at the end of 1983. The only way she was able to survive was from collecting unemployment and by the financial generosity provided by Roland. When Margaret went back to Montana to visit relatives, she gave her niece a key for a safety deposit box. She said if something bad happened, it's because she saw something at her job and someone was going to murder her. Margaret's family had her admitted to a hospital in Glasgow, Montana. Her family was confused and didn't understand what was wrong. They didn't know if it was a substance abuse problem or severe depression, or maybe something else. Margaret's family witnessed her crying in the corner of the hospital room, and they found it unbearable to see her this way. Margaret's mom, Mary, didn't know what to do, so she bought her daughter a train ticket back to her home in Wisconsin. Mary came to Green Bay for Thanksgiving weekend to visit her daughter in 1983. This was the last time that she would ever see her daughter alive. On December 26, 1983, Terry Weasel Affle drove past Margaret's house around 4 p.m. and saw her car was home, so he stopped in. Margaret had not seen her friend for several weeks, so she invited him inside. They chatted for more than an hour to catch up on their holiday season news. Margaret had spent time with Bobby, Mary Lou, and Bobby Jr., but other than that, she was alone tonight. Bobby Jr. was spending the night at his father's house. Margaret and Terry Affle had known each other for a few years at this point. They met while Margaret was bartending at the Hydrant and began hanging out since summer. The commonality they shared was that they did not fit into society like most people. Margaret was not working. She lived off government assistance and unemployment. Terry wore a brace on his leg, which was broken in the past, and he had often used a cane to walk. Athel was a member of the Drifters Motorcycle Club and was taking classes at Fox Valley Technical College in Appleton. Terry suggested that they go see a movie and then go out for drinks. Margaret thought it was a good idea. At 5:15 p.m., they left in Terry's 1969 Chevrolet Chevelle for a night out on the Green Bay town. The first stop of the night was a place called the Surf Club 2 because they wanted a drink before the movie. Margaret cashed her $140 unemployment check with the owner of the bar. The pair left and headed to the Stadium Cinema, which was near Lambeau Field, the home of the Green Bay Packers. Once the movie was over, they returned to the Surf Club 2 after 9 p.m. The owner's wife was now tending bar. She knew Margaret well, since the bar was close to Margaret's house, and she was a regular there. However, she had never seen Athel before. They had ordered tequila shots and taps of Old Style, which was a popular beer in Wisconsin in the 1980s. Terry and Margaret played pool and video games. They seemed to enjoy hanging out together, but they were just friends and nothing more. The duo left from the Surf Club 2 around 11 p.m. The bartender surmised they had consumed 6 shots and 6 beers each. Now Weasel's 1969 Chevelle rumbled down the street and headed towards 618 Bodart Way, which was the location of a bar called the Back 40. Weasel patronized the bar because it was owned by fellow drifter Mark Lukensmeyer. Randy Whiting's life headed in a direction that made him happy. He felt like he belonged when he became a prospect member of the DC Eagles Motorcycle Club. He remembered back to his childhood, and he never had a sense of family. Randy was from O'Connell, Wisconsin, which is a small town just over a 30-minute drive from Green Bay and only hosts 2,000 people. His parents divorced before he was a year old, and they were both alcoholics. Social services removed him from their care and placed Randy with his aunt. Randy felt that his aunt only liked him for the extra income she received from the government, since she already had 8 kids of her own. Randy did not like living with her, so he used athletics to escape the reality of his home life. He was a track star at O'Connell High School and won several races. After graduation in the summer of 1978, Randy left O'Connell and moved to Green Bay. He took a job at Packerland Packing, where he cut cow meat with a long boning knife all day long. He quit after 4 months. Randy took a job in a machine shop for a while, but quit that too. Instead of looking for another boring job, he enlisted in the Army. In the military, Randy was a chemical specialist, and he had lived up to his potential by graduating first in his class. The Army sent Randy to Germany, where he earned a few letters of commendation and 2 Army badges he was proud of, a rifle M16 badge and hand grenade badge. But trouble had its way of finding Randy, and his time in the Army taught him that he did not like following rules that others imposed on him. One time, Randy tried to break up a fight, which had escalated and turned into him receiving a reprimand for fighting. The military unit where he was stationed had a culture of drug use, which was not good for Randy. He got in trouble for driving a military vehicle while under the influence of drugs. When a new officer came in and took charge of Randy's unit, his attitude took a turn for the worse. Randy had been living off post with the military's permission and had a traffic accident, which was not his fault. His new commanding officer accused him of driving drunk and took away his license. That didn't stop Randy from driving. When they caught him, they forced him to return to living on the post again. Randy put in a request to take leave, which the military turned down. Randy left anyways. The Army reassigned him to Fort Riley in Kansas, where he went AWOL for several days. The Army had its fill of Randy Whiting, and they gave him an other than honorable conditions discharge, which meant that he couldn't re-enlist in the military or receive military benefits. Randy seemed unaffected by this outcome. He returned to Green Bay and took a job with a paper mill. He met Vicki Chamberlain at a biker function, and they started dating. Randy appeared to be getting his life together. He moved in with Vicki and her 6-year-old daughter into a Green Bay apartment on Christina Street, which was only a few blocks from Margaret Anderson's home. Randy quit his job at the paper mill after 7 months. He was still searching for something missing from his life. Randy's sister Barb was dating Mark Hinton, who was a member of the DC Eagles motorcycle club. Randy and Mark struck up a fast friendship. Mark was Randy's way into the DC Eagles. Randy Gargoyle Whiting now felt that he had a sense of belonging and family that he'd been searching for his entire life. In DC Eagles circles, Mark was known as AD. Like many of his fellow club members, AD was an outsider. He was an imposing figure and worked as a bouncer at some of the more seedy Green Bay establishments, like Spanky's Bar, Stairway to Heaven Massage Parlor, and Angie's Sex Clinic. Dennis Stumpner was shooting pool too, and he was also a DC Eagle Club member. He went by the nickname Bobber. The Eagles looked across the street and noticed the back 40 had opened. They knew the owner, drifter Mark Shotgun Lukensmeyer, and they wanted to go there. It was around 2 p.m. when they headed across the street to Lukensmeyer's bar. The back 40 was a first-floor bar with an apartment upstairs. The Eagles drank pitchers of beer all afternoon and evening. Mark Lukensmeyer's main bartender was Chris Shevlik, who was also known as Snooky in motorcycle circles. The Drifters and the DC Eagles were distinctly separate motorcycle clubs, but there were ties between the two groups. They also had a shared experience of not fitting into society and being okay with it. The Drifters and the Eagles would often hang out at the same swap meets, where people would buy, sell, and trade motorcycle parts. The Drifters were known for riding bikes and partying, but most held regular jobs in the real world. The DC Eagles had a well-deserved reputation of being a tougher bunch. The Eagles would make their money by dealing drugs or providing protection for the sex industry establishments. While the 1970s and 80s were a different time in our culture, many of the people in Wisconsin were unaware how the values of the motorcycle gang subculture diverged from the norm. Members of both clubs valued their bikes more than they valued the lives and well-being of women. Talking back to a man would often result in a public beating. The DC Eagles granted women no mercies, while Drifters were more lenient. Women were called old ladies and were not shared between club members. They saw single women in another light. When they came to party, the women were sometimes drugged, be it voluntary or not. They referred to these women as train cuties, and they were used as sex toys by a train of men. There were also many personal connections within each motorcycle club. Mark Hinton was seeing Randy Whiting's sister, and Dennis Stumpner's sister was married to the DC Eagles Wisconsin chapter president. Mark Lukensmeyer knew his bartender, Chris Shevlik, since high school, and Chris's husband, Jack Shevlik, was the president of the Drifters. Lukensmeyer was tending bar, but he was already drunk. Chris took over the bar before 6:30 p.m. There was beer, marijuana, speed, acid, and other drugs consumed right out in the open in the bar that night. This wasn't typical, and drugs would normally be ingested in the bathroom or outside in the alley. Mark Lukensmeyer's girlfriend, Donna Vanderveeren, arrived to the back 40 at 8 p.m. She saw that her boyfriend was drunk at this early hour. Around 10 p.m., Adie and Bobber took Whiting's buck knife away from him. It didn't take much for him to get his temper to flare, and Gargoyle spun out of control. He got in a fight with a man sitting at the bar. The altercation was broken up swiftly. The party atmosphere was still going strong when Margaret and Athel arrived at the back 40 just after 11 p.m. The friends ordered Old Styles and went to play darts. Lukensmeyer had known Margaret superficially through his friendship with her ex-husband, Bob Anderson. Lukensmeyer tried to talk his girlfriend Donna into borrowing her 1974 Gran Torino. When Hinton and Whiting went out to the bars 2 nights prior, the Pinto they were driving stalled. Lukensmeyer wanted to take the DC Eagles over to give the car a jump start. Donna thought to herself that this was a terrible idea because everyone was beyond drunk. Donna offered to drive, but no one was ready to leave. They told Donna that she wasn't going anywhere and just laughed at her. Donna needed to extricate herself from this deteriorating situation. When her boyfriend went to the bathroom, she hurried out the side door and went home. Donna had to work at 7 a.m. the next morning, and the last thing she wanted to do was put up with nonsense. The minute she arrived home, the phone rang. Chris Shevlik begged her to come back and get her boyfriend out of the bar. He was so drunk that he was getting more out of control by the minute. Donna got in her car and reluctantly returned to the back 40. Donna asked Lucensmeyer if he was ready to go home. He yelled at her and said she isn't leaving until he's ready to leave. Donna went back outside into the frigid night and sat in her car. Lucensmeyer followed her outside, opened the car door, and removed her keys from the ignition. He went back into the bar through the side entrance by the parking lot and locked the door behind him. Donna had to walk around to the front door and re-enter the bar. In a calm manner, Donna asked her boyfriend for the keys, but he wouldn't give them back. After 20 minutes of trying, Donna gave up. She walked down the street to a phone booth and placed a call to the police at 12:14 a.m. Officers Donald Chick and John Thompson responded to the call. The officers did not want to go into a biker bar to solve the situation, so they offered Donna a ride home instead. They dropped her off at 12:24 a.m. Meanwhile, at the back 40, Margaret was drunk and acted unpredictably. Ethel left her alone to go talk with someone he knew, and Margaret got into it with another female patron. Margaret started taunting the woman, who was a regular at the bar and also a drifter old lady. Margaret called the woman names and stuck her tongue out. A fight broke out between the women that involved hair pulling and rolling around on the floor. It was broken up after a minute. Ethel sensed that they were no longer welcome at the bar and told Margaret that it was time to get going. It was almost bar time, and most people were leaving anyhow. Margaret got into the passenger seat of Terry's car. Once he joined her, she was yelling and swearing at him about his drifter friends. She grabbed his hair and slapped him. Terry had enough of Margaret, so he yelled at her and slapped her back. He told her that she could walk home. As this fight was escalating between Margaret and Ethel, Chris Shevlik was closing down the bar with Mark Lucensmeyer at 12:45 a.m. The three DC Eagles, AD, Gargoyle, and Bobber, were waiting outside for Lucensmeyer because they needed a ride. Lucensmeyer and Shevlik turned off the lights and exited the bar through the side door. Chris walked over to her car, which was right next to Ethel's, and saw the two of them fighting. Ethel told Chris to go beat up Margaret because he was done with her. Chris tried to ignore him, but she saw Terry Ethel get out of his car and walk around to the passenger door to yank Margaret out by her hair. He threw her onto the ground and kicked her with his good leg. Even through her inebriation, Margaret could feel the pain caused by his steel-toed boot as he assailed her with kicks. Chris told him to stop. Ethel pulled her up off the ground, then gave Margaret one more kick in the backside, shoving her across the alley towards the three DC Eagles, who were waiting for the ride. Ethel told the Eagles that they could have her. They could screw her brains out. Terry Weasel Ethel got back into his 1969 Chevelle and drove away without looking back. The three DC Eagles beat and kicked Margaret as Lucensmeyer watched from the side door. Chris Shevlik heard the force of the kicks as they rippled through the cold Wisconsin air. She swore she could hear Margaret's bones cracking with each blow she received. Chris again begged them to knock it off. Mark Shotgun Lucensmeyer told her to leave. Chris tried a third and final time to get them to stop. Lucensmeyer yelled at Chris to get the hell out of there. At that point, Chris felt like there was nothing more she could do. She got in her car and pulled out onto the street. She took one final look in the alley, and now all four men were kicking Margaret. Witnessing this violent scene bothered Chris, but it was nothing that she hadn't seen before. In the motorcycle club subculture, it was not uncommon for drunk bikers to abuse women physically. She had witnessed it countless times, but she did not want to put her life in jeopardy by calling the cops, or trying to help Margaret any further. After all, she was the wife of the Drifters' president, and there would be hell to pay if she started a war between the clubs by getting the DC Eagles into trouble. What Chris didn't realize was that the Drifters and the Eagles would end up pitted against each other based on how the rest of that night unfolded. Lucensmeyer unlocked the side door of the back 40, and all four men took Margaret back inside. I'm going to end the episode right here, and I'll release part 2 of Margaret Anderson's story next week. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Beyond Contempt. My podcast recommendation is a show called Evidence Locker True Crime. They cover cases from all over the world, many of which I've never heard about before, and the narrator has a soothing voice. But I'll let them tell you all about it.
The Evidence Locker is a weekly podcast about international true crime. Made by hardcore true crime fans, it's somewhat grungy. Join us as we explore the dark corners of the globe. We've covered cases from Sweden, Brazil, Australia, and the US, to mention a few. Find us on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Please visit BeyondContemptPodcast.com for links to the sources and music used in this episode. If you like talking about true crime cases, join the Beyond Contempt Podcast Facebook group. Please consider supporting the show by leaving a positive review on Apple Podcasts. And thanks for listening.